Well, hello there and welcome to our second live lesson. So this is lesson 2, where we're going to look specifically at stress. So I'm just going to check to see that we've actually gone live. Tells me that we have. Hey Sarah, Holly, good. Right, I can see some of you coming on. Wonderful. It's always so disconcerting waiting for people to arrive. So while we are waiting for others to arrive, I just thought I'd reiterate why we set this group up in the first place. So having all been told to stay home and to only go outside for food or health reasons or for essential work and to stay 2 meters away from other people, the reality is that for many of us, those activities, those leisure and social activities, and specifically the ones that we rely on to enable us to stay in a positive mental state, are no longer available to us. So we've all had to adapt very quickly to this new rhythm of life. So a different way of keeping in touch with people, and very unfamiliar methods of working as well. And as you'll now know, if you were on last week's live, and perhaps you already know, because our brain interprets all change, and that's all change without exception, initially as a threat. For some of us, this will have an impact on our mental well-being, and in effect on our emotional and psychological resilience, both of which can affect our physical resilience, and of course that also works vice versa as well. And the problem is that when our resilience is low, our ability to maintain our motivation and our focus, and in effect our ability to survive adversity, or more specifically now a pandemic, can become very compromised. And so that's the reason why we set this group up, because what we wanted to do is provide the information, the tools, but really importantly as well the confidence to enable us all to better manage our mental well-being and that of those that we live and work with during this very challenging time. So before we go on, we're going to be talking about stress this evening. It might not surprise you that I'd like to ask you just to type into the comments here something that's been good in the last week. Now you'll remember from last week that it can be absolutely anything at all, and it also doesn't need to be something big either, because there's always something that's been good, even if it's a very, very small something. And while you're thinking about that, I'll just have a little bit of a think about mine, because today, interestingly, the day that I come on here to talk to you about stress, has been, without exception, probably in the last 5 weeks, or we're coming into week 6 now since lockdown, the most stressful day that I've had. And that's just the sheer volume of things that I'm holding in my mind and that I've had to do today. And actually it was an effort to get here on time this evening. So I'm just going to think about what's been good. And while I'm doing that, I'm just going to have a little check and see what responses we've had. Hello Ems. Hi Sarah. Hello Anna. Hi Sharon again. Nice to see you. Lucy. Hi Caddy. Hey Beryl. Jay, nice to see you. Good for joining us. Now, just share what's been good. It's just good for other people to read that, and I'll share with you that what's been good for me is that having had to cancel our plans to upgrade our kitchen recently, we made the decision to give it a facelift with some paint. We found this amazing product called French Chic, and having waited for 4 weeks for our paint to arrive, it finally arrived last week, and as a result our kitchen's had a completely new lease of life, and every day so far it's made me smile. So that's what's been good. Let's have an idea of what yours are. Wow, gift of the caterpillar chocolate cake. I had one of those for my 40th. Socially distanced chats with 4 people outside my house. That's really nice. Running webinars for my colleagues. Yes, thank you Sarah. I'm sorry that I missed your webinar, but the feedback's been exceptional. So thank you. So you might remember the 2 reasons that I asked you to share something that's been good from the last week, and tonight I'm going to share a little bit more about why we do that. But before we do, let's talk a little bit more about stress, because whilst it's true that sometimes compromised mental health, and that's really what we're all about at Mental Health in the Workplace, whilst sometimes it's as a result of early experiences that may have resulted in perhaps some ingrained beliefs or patterns of behaviour that are not desirable, Many mental health issues, if you like, result directly from our current environment and our current circumstances, and really importantly, the extent to which we are able to cope with what's happening in our lives. So often mental ill health or compromised mental health occurs as a direct result of stress, and that's where we're going to spend a little bit of time tonight looking at what stress is, how it's created, and specifically on the impact on the brain and the body as well. So let's start with defining stress. Stress is defined, and there's lots of definitions, but I really like this one. It's the result of an influx of certain chemicals in the brain and also in the body, so specifically adrenaline and cortisol, that occur when some action is required. Now, what you might have noticed about that definition is that it doesn't differentiate between good or bad, or positive or negative. And that's why I like that definition, because stress itself is not a bad thing, or indeed a problem. In fact, these stress chemicals or stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, are extremely important, because what they do is they energize the body and they heighten our focus and our courage, giving us the ability to take action when action is required. So in the short term, these chemicals are a massive help to us, not least because they help to keep us safe, and they are there to enable the survival of our species. Stress hormones also help with some other things too, like for instance adventure. They give us the motivation to try new things. Performance, so performance in any area of our life, whether that's sports performance or whether that's a presentation we have to give. I need a little bit of cortisol right now because I'm here wanting to do a good job for you. It gives us the energy, an energy injection that we need in order to do well. And then the third one is personal growth, because any form of growth as a person requires us to step out of our comfort zone ultimately, and the minute that we step out of any form of comfort, our body will produce some stress hormones to help. My cat's just visiting us there. So stress isn't always a problem, but in the long term, high levels of adrenaline, high levels of cortisol can be a problem. And when it is a problem, it is defined as the feeling or the state of mental or emotional strain or tension that results from perceived adverse or demanding circumstances, and this is the really important bit, the subsequent feeling of not being able to cope. So it's the feeling of not being able to cope that creates stress to be a problem. Prolonged stress or excessive stress can impact a person's cognitive, physical, emotional and also psychological, so sometimes described as behavioural, functioning. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that when stress occurs in order to help us to meet daily challenges and to perform better, so those things I was describing earlier on, our body produces cortisol, and it produces it at an upper limit. So in other words, our body will produce just the right amount of cortisol required for us to cope with the situation. But when stress is inflicted on us due to extreme pressures, it isn't capped, so it just keeps coming. And this constant and prolonged release of cortisol into our body does a few things. So firstly, it increases blood pressure and cholesterol, and it weakens the immune system. And what that does is that results in low resilience, low confidence, low motivation, and also poor concentration too, which significantly impacts our ability to function, normally, if you like, in the way that we normally would. This eventually can lead to poor mental health and also poor physical health too, and in extreme cases, quite serious health conditions. So it is true that stress is good for us. Equally, it's true that excessive or prolonged stress is very, very damaging. So what causes it? Stress. when we think about this, I think, let's be honest, it's almost impossible to go through an entire day without hearing about stress. We hear about the stress of the economy. We hear about the stress of the housing market. We hear about the stresses of the country's government whenever we turn on the news, and that's especially true at the moment. Closer to home, many of us find that we're stressed before the day's even begun. It may be the stress of the alarm clock going off in the morning, perhaps having not had enough sleep. And in fact, I always find it interesting that it's called an alarm clock. We wake up alarmed. The doom and gloom on the news, which, at the moment, things are incredibly challenging and very, very worrying. But we're being exposed to that every time we turn on the news. Perhaps the children refusing to eat their breakfast or having a barney with each other. And at the moment, perhaps just trying to make that 9 a.m. meeting, or the kids perhaps want to get set up on YouTube so that they can do their Joe Wicks. We haven't even started work yet. And we're already experiencing stress. So we all have days where we feel more stress than others, and that's really understandable in this modern business age, because we are required to do so much more now with limited time. People, whether they're clients or customers or parents or children or managers, have higher expectations than ever before. Our deadlines are tighter, our workloads are heavier, and we hear this a lot. And we're also expected to be available and in touch 24/7. And if you add to that right now that very few of us, as I said earlier, have the social and leisure activities available to us that we would normally rely on to keep us in positive mental health. That's a lot for our body to cope with. And our body does its best, but inevitably we experience symptoms. And these stresses can affect how we think, they can affect how we feel, they can affect how we perform, and also how we behave. And they also affect how our body works. So I mentioned this earlier on in 4 different areas. So the first one is cognitively. So these stressors, these symptoms, can manifest cognitively. That might include things like an inability to focus or to concentrate, perhaps difficulty making judgments or decisions, perhaps poor retention or recollection of information, uncharacteristic errors, forgetfulness, disorganisation. So, these may be symptoms that we're not necessarily aware are symptoms of stress, things that perhaps we get a little bit used to experiencing. Stress can manifest emotionally too, and emotional symptoms include things like feeling overwhelmed or powerless, rising to anger without any kind of obvious cause, moodiness, irritability, guilt or fear without cause, isolating, loneliness, depression is an obvious one, obsessions, paranoia, sadness. Sometimes these are very natural, valid responses to what's going on, and sometimes they're symptoms of extreme stress. Stress can manifest physically too, so symptoms like headaches, that can be a stress symptom. Tiredness or fatigue can be directly linked to excessive or prolonged stress. A dry mouth or throat, difficulty with sleeping, digestion problems are directly linked to stress often. Rashes, eczema, clammy hands, shakiness, tremors, twitches, these are all potential symptoms of stress. Even muscle tension, which is felt very physically, has been linked also to excessive or prolonged stress. And then the 4th way that stress can manifest is behaviourally. So psychologically is another way of describing that. So it can manifest in panic, tearfulness, self-harm, aggressiveness, social withdrawal, fidgeting, nail biting, relationship problems is a common one, an increase in alcohol or caffeine, changes in appetite, and grinding teeth or clenching of fists. So these are the 4 areas that stress can manifest, and we're not always aware when we're experiencing these symptoms that they are symptoms perhaps of stress. And undoubtedly we will all experience a significant number of these symptoms at some point in our life, which demonstrates how common and in fact how normal stress is. But whilst it's common and normal to experience these symptoms, that doesn't change the fact that they are at best uncomfortable, and at worst they can be very debilitating and can have a serious impact on our health, especially when they're experienced frequently or indeed intensively. So I'm going to share a graphic with you after this live to help you to identify those 4 areas and specifically how stress impacts you. So please look out for that, because it can be very useful to have that insight personally into how stress impacts you on an individual basis. You know, I'm happy to share that when I am experiencing excessive stress or prolonged stress, it will tend to manifest in a very cognitive way. So I will experience brain fog, I will forget things, and in fact there are people in my business life in particular who have, if you like, permission, because they know this stuff, to point that out to me. And my business partner has been known to say to me in one conversation, "You've forgotten 3 things which are so out of character for you. 3 things in this conversation, small things, but you know, I think you need to, you know, look at your workload, or take the weekend off, or you know, go and take the evening off or something." So it can be really useful to have that understanding. So we've looked at what stress is from a psychological perspective, so from a stressor's perspective. But how is stress caused from a physiological perspective? And in order to understand this, we need to take a tour of the human brain and about 2 million years of evolution, which I'm going to start to give you the beginning of in the next 5 minutes or so. So I just want you to imagine a human brain. Most of us have seen a picture of one. Some of us have actually held one in our hands. And there are 2 really important parts to our brain. First of all, there's a part of our brain called the intellectual brain, and this sits at the front of our skull in the prefrontal cortex. And this is the part of our brain that we know as us. So it's our conscious part. It's the part that interacts with the external world. It's the part that we are using when we are aware of our interactions together. And it's also the part that we don't share with other animals. Now, this part of our brain, this intellectual brain, is attached to a vast intellectual resource. And we call this the intellectual mind. And the intellectual mind stores all of the experiences that we've ever had, all of the knowledge and skills that we've developed over time as a result of those experiences. And it stores them like a vast library so that we have access to it whenever we need it. This enables us to make decisions. It enables us to be creative, to be inventive, to come up with solutions, to put forward persuasive arguments. Because it's logical, this part of our brain. It's rational. It actually thinks and reasons. And it's the part of the brain that has been absolutely key to our human species, not just surviving, but thriving. Because without this part of our brain, we as human beings would not have been able to invent things like the telephone or the wheel or the computer, or have discovered flight. We wouldn't have the internet if it wasn't for this part of the brain. We wouldn't be able to write poetry or music, and we certainly wouldn't have ever made it to space. So when we operate from this part of our brain, we generally get things right in life, because it always approaches any situation positively. It will always come up with solutions based on a proper assessment of the situation. So it's a preferable part of the brain to operate from. Now there's another part of our brain which is just as important and plays just as an important a role, and it's called the primitive brain. And this is the original part of our brain. So this is the part that existed way before the intellectual part of the brain even developed. And there are 3 distinct parts to this. At the centre is the most influential, is called the amygdala, and this is our fight or flight response, so you've probably heard of that. The second part is the hippocampus, and this stores all of our behavioural patterns, all of our automatic responses. That's both the good ones and the bad ones. And the third part is the hypothalamus, which is responsible for all the chemical responses in our brain. So, for example, the release of cortisol, the release of adrenaline, and also the release of our feel-good hormones as well, which we're going to talk about not next week but the week after. Okay? Now, all three of these aspects of the primitive mind work together to help us survive danger. And when we are in true danger, this part of our brain helps to keep us alive. And in fact, that's its main purpose, survival. It isn't interested in enabling us to be the very best version of ourselves or to thrive in our lives. It's interested in one thing and one thing only, and that is survival. So to demonstrate this in action, I just want you to imagine that when you next leave your home, whether it's tonight for a walk or tomorrow at some point, you run into a polar bear. What would happen? Just think about that for a minute. You run into a polar bear in your local town or on your high street or on your street where you live. Well, the first thing that's going to happen is your anxiety is going to go up. And as a result of that, you're going to get symptoms of anxiety. So you're going to get hot flushing and sweating, and the heart's going to start pumping, and you're going to get rapid breath and perhaps even a churning stomach. And you're going to be off like a shot. Now, from a neuroscience perspective, you are going to lose intellectual control and immediately move from the intellectual part of the brain down to the primitive part of the brain, which sits at the back of the brain. Your brain would trigger your fight or flight response in your amygdala first. Okay, that's the first thing that would happen. Your hippocampus would then look at previous patterns of behaviour that have enabled us all through the years to survive running into a polar bear, and these patterns are stored ancestrally. And it would make the split decision, although it's not really a decision, it's an instinct to run. Your hypothalamus then would flood your system with the stress hormone cortisol, which would increase your heart rate and blood pressure so that you are pumping more blood to your heart. It would tense up your muscles so you're ready to run away as fast as you can, because it needs you to survive to live another day. It's an amazing process, actually. Even every time I say it, I just think it's just remarkable, because this happens in a split second, less than that. Now, this is really great if there's a polar bear there, because in those circumstances this response is entirely appropriate, and you would be really pleased that your body had responded in this way, as the chemical response and the subsequent behaviour would enable you to do exactly what was necessary, and that is to remove yourself from the imminent danger. So the primitive brain will always do its job, which is to keep you safe. The unfortunate thing is that our brain doesn't know the difference between reality and imagination, and so this response to perceived danger happens whether the perceived danger is real or not. And the reality is that many of the perceived polar bears that we encounter in this modern day and age aren't actually real threats to us at all. So this response can be really unhelpful too. This response increases the cortisol in our system by 500%. And that spike in cortisol then takes between 2 and 3 days to leave our system. That spike in cortisol also depletes our serotonin, which is a lovely hormone that governs happiness, and I'm going to be talking about that the week after next. It also fogs our brain, so it becomes much more difficult for us to access the information in this great library of resources that we have in our prefrontal cortex. And so suddenly simple things like remembering somebody's name or what was discussed in a meeting becomes a real challenge. And it also has an impact on our digestive system too, because the last thing we need to be doing when we're faced with a polar bear is digest food. And that's why we get tummy kind of issues too. So whilst this is an entirely appropriate response, it's not always a helpful one, when actually what we're really worrying about is a work meeting or a conversation or something that hasn't happened yet. You may be wondering, okay, so how do we create this anxiety then that causes us to move from the intellectual, very sensible part of our brain to the primitive part that has a huge and important role to play, but isn't always necessarily as helpful? And that is the focus of next week's live lesson, when I'm going to explain how we can bypass this process that I've just talked about and deal with stress a lot more effectively. So I really hope that exploration of stress has been useful and that you've enjoyed this lesson. Next Monday, which is the 11th of May, gosh, I can't believe that we're going to be in mid-May next week, is our third live lesson number 3, and it's an exploration of prolonged and excessive stress, and also the part that sleep plays in alleviating that. Sleep has a massive role to play. We're going to explore the concept of our metaphorical stress buckets, and I'll introduce you to a way of replicating the part of our sleep that helps us to keep this metaphorical stress bucket at a manageable level. So you'll leave with a much greater understanding of what creates extreme stress and a new appreciation of the importance of getting really good quality sleep. Please pop the date in your diary and the time too, and if you haven't already, please turn on notifications for this group so that you're alerted when this page goes live. I can't wait to see you then, and if for any reason you can't make it, remember the recording is always available soon after. And in the meantime, have a wonderful week, and I'll see you and interact with you in the group in the meantime. Thank you so much for joining. Have a good evening. Bye bye.